Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? Story 1. Grandma didn't decide to move in with us because she loved us so much and wanted to spend more time with us. Grandma moved in with us because her son was a meth addict and convinced her to put his name on the house. Grandma moved in with us because her son was a druggie and convinced her to put his name on the house and take all of the money out of it for renovations and leave her homeless. She had a heart attack that night she found out and now has to live with a pacemaker. Screw you, Uncle Roy. We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description. Story 2. My cousins lived with us for a while and we thought that was fun because it's like a sleepover every day. One time our mom even took us out of school to pick them up. I learned later that it was because Child Protective Services took my cousins away from their mom because of mental health issues. My mom offered to take her sister's kids until she got her mental health back in order. My cousins live with their mom now and their mom is in a much better condition mentally. Story 3. My grandma retired and she still decided to work for her brother in his restaurant to save up money for when she dies. Funerals are obviously expensive. She insisted that he would hold on to her paychecks and pay for her funeral when she dies. He never did. Story 4. My father got my mother pregnant when he was her teacher in high school. He was 30 and married. She was 15 and his student. They ran off together, he got a divorce, and they got married in a state that allowed marriage at 16, 2 months before my older brother was born. Story 5. I'm still at least one family secret. I'm adopted and found my biological father. He begged me not to reach out to any of my half-siblings as it would ruin his life and standing in the community. The sad thing is, I'm not even his first secret child. I have an older half-sister that he also begged not to reach out to family. So that's 2 kids he's had because he cheated on his wife. I can only imagine how often he cheats to have at least 2 women end up pregnant. My half-sister and I call 23andMe, how we met, 23andMark, because who knows how many more kids he might have out there. Pretty sure he's been terrified since at-home DNA kits became a thing. Story 6. When I was young, I was told my uncle, maternal side, had died suddenly of cancer. I was around 6 years old. My grandfather and another uncle had died within the previous 2 years. So I was, sadly enough for that age, familiar with death and with funerals. It was a closed casket, and when I asked my mom why they didn't open it like they did for the other funerals, she just said that's what his family wanted and to not mention it anymore. Years later, when I was 12 years old, I was staying at my paternal grandmother's place and she was going off on some religious rant, as she was apt to do, and the topic of hell came up. My grandma, never one to hold the punches, flatly said, "Like your Uncle Charlie. He's in hell, God rest his poor soul." Of course, I asked her what she meant by that, only to have her look at me like I had asked the stupidest question imaginable. Once the shock of my profound ignorance wore off, she simply said, "Well, child, unaliving yourself is a one-way ticket to hell, and if shooting yourself in the head isn't unaliving yourself, then I don't know what is." That conversation is forever burned into my brain. She was an incredibly warm, caring woman, but she was also very matter-of-fact and honest. And she would say some cold stuff sometimes due to her insane religious beliefs. She hugged me and baked me cookies afterward and apologized for having to be the one to tell me about how he really died. Story 7. When my dad used to send me birthday cards every year when I was a young girl, my mother left my dad while pregnant with me for a good reason. Even though I never got to meet him when I was young, I was still glad to receive a card from him with a few bucks, acknowledging I was alive and that he did one day want to see me. Around 14 to 15, I learned that my mother had written every single one of those letters, and my grandfather would mail it to ourselves to make it seem legit. I never, ever actually received any letter from him. Edit. I didn't expect this comment to blow up as I slept, but I wanted to answer a few questions that I got. My dad was a pretty terrible guy. Without airing all my family's dirty laundry, he was an intimate abuser. I did eventually meet him 2 times. Once at my aunt's funeral at 17 where he wrote me a long letter about how he wished he was better, and once when I was 19 when he tried to establish a relationship. He gave me terrible vibes and I never answered his attempts to reach out after that. And I'm much happier this way. My mom raised 2 kids by herself. Unfortunately, my family has its issues. My family suffers from alcoholism and my mother has deep mental health issues. Growing up with her wasn't always easy and it still isn't now. Some days she is lucid and is a wonderful mother. Other days she's violent and unstable. But I know deep down inside her, where she is well and unafflicted by her illness, she's an incredible mother and kind. I just have to accept that she is unwell and try to remember good times. My family and I are estranged these days, but it makes me want to work harder to be a stable and loving mother if I do become one someday. At the end of everything, I do still love my mom, and I'm thankful she shielded me from him. Estranged parents are always somewhat of an issue. And if OP's dad was as abusive as OP says they were, then really good on the mother for shielding the OP from that. That's a really difficult thing to know that your child would naturally want to connect with their father, but not be able to locate them, and you don't want them to locate them because you have good reason not to. Also, good on OP for realizing that they're probably better off if they don't contact their father. I hope that OP's mother continues to get better mentally and it just all sort of works out. It rarely ever does, I know, but I hope it does. Story 8. My grandmother actually legally disowned my mother for marrying my dad. The family house was supposed to go to my mom, but after the disowning, Grandma didn't say who she wanted the house to go to, resulting in a decades-long family feud that has split the family even to this day. Sad thing is, my parents actually ended up divorced after 20 years of marriage. Mom took care of my grandma till the end and was the only one who handled the funeral arrangements when my grandma passed 2 years ago. She never asked for the house back. It's worth millions. Nobody told me any of this until I was 30. Story 9. That my favorite cousin wasn't missing. All I knew growing up, he was 13 years older than me, was that he would come and go a lot. He lived with us when I was a baby, and after he moved out, he would visit every 6 months or so out of the blue. But we never visited or called him. His visits were one of my favorite things in the world. I loved him like a brother. By the time I was a teenager, I did understand that he had issues with his parents. They had kicked him out at 13 and my parents took him in. But that kind of childhood messes with you. In between visits to my parents, he avoided the rest of the family, moved a lot, and didn't hold jobs for very long, which is why my parents didn't always know where he was. But in my later teens, he stopped coming over at all. I asked repeatedly if anyone had heard from him, and I was told no. I asked about contacting him and was told that no one had a number or address for him. He would come around when he felt like it. But it stretched on for years. I was really worried he was dead, and I missed him. In my later 20s, I found out that everyone knew where he was the whole time. He was in prison for murder. From what I hear, it was actually somewhat justified. He was defending his new wife, who I never got to meet. I also found out some super crappy things about how the extended family sided with his screwed up parents and refused to help him or his wife when he got arrested, and that they shamed my dad into not helping either. I tried to send a message to him in prison, but I don't know if he ever got it. I wish he knew that I didn't turn my back on him for decades like everyone else did. I just didn't know. Story 10. Not so much let in on, as we found out by accident, but apparently my dad's first love and him got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father for years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad even 30 years later. We were always told he was a mentor until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name, and we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought that up with him. Story 11. That my cousin was actually my half-brother. Mom got pregnant in college and my aunt and uncle adopted him. And that my dad wasn't my biological father. Mom and dad got divorced, she got pregnant by another man, and my dad wasn't able to have kids of his own, so they got remarried and he raised me as his own. Story 12. When my grandfather died, he wrote his will on his deathbed. He left his entire estate to my family, which was enormous. His wife, however, who despised us in the biggest screw you move I've ever seen, wrote a directly conflicting will, leaving the estate to her family, none of whom I've ever met, and then unalived herself. It took around 5 years in legal hell to sort that out. We ended up winning the case in the end, but it cost so much that we couldn't afford to keep his $3 million house anymore. Story 13. Not very much a secret, but took me until I was older to understand what was happening. My mom would sometimes have us play a game called Army, which consisted of me, my mom, and my siblings army crawling around in our apartment, kind of a hide-and-seek style game. She would yell, "Hit the deck," randomly, and we would all drop and find a hiding spot. We would giggle and giggle while my mom army crawled around looking for us. We loved the game so much. I realized a few years ago while retelling the story that we lived in a really terrible neighborhood, and she would yell it out whenever she heard gunfire outside the building. I'm assuming she was worried about stray bullets. What an insanely wholesome way to keep your children safe. Because yeah, they're not really going to understand what's going on at that point, and it's just going to scare them to say that it's for their safety, so if you make it a game, they're going to play along and love it. Big props to OP's mom. Story 14. My step-grandfather has always been an alcoholic. As a kid, at like 6 years old, I would mix his drink as he liked it and bring it to him in the living room. Don't ask what the drink was a mix of, because I literally can't remember. And my grandpa would always act funny. I always liked spending time with him because I found him funny. So I never saw the bad side of his alcoholism, and he never made me drink or anything. So overall, it didn't really have a negative impact on me. But before I was born, he would get so drunk he threatened to unalive my grandma. And when he got into a car accident and came home, he was bleeding badly from his head. And he started saying my granny shot him. He even threw out some of the wedding photos my parents had. I never knew how horrible he was. Maybe because he liked kids or something. He would make me cocoa and watch Garfield with me when I was a kid. He was never a bad influence in my life, so it was weird to me when I found out these things about him. Before he died, though, he really regretted drinking and completely stopped. He became really depressed, too, until his granddaughter, biological, was born. He was so happy about his granddaughter. He died regretting everything and a sober man. He was happy to have been able to meet his one and only biological granddaughter. Regardless of everything, he really did change in the end, and everyone was really upset when he died. Story 15. When I was young, I thought it was really nice that my Nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting on a bit and it meant she was looked after and there was always people around. Aunt had 6 kids. Occasionally, Aunt would gripe about being the one looking after Nana, since Aunt is also one of many kids. And being young, I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with Nana too, I didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young, I think, just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason Nana lives with Aunt is because Aunt and her husband convinced Nana to put the house in their name, so they could look after her affairs, and sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's gone now. Because of this, her siblings refuse to give Aunt a penny towards looking after Nana since it's her fault Nana has no money or assets, and instead paid to take Nana out all the time. Meals, shopping, activities, so she doesn't go without, but they let Aunt struggle under the weight of Nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they're not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think about what a terrible person she is. Story 16. My grandmother ran off and had an affair, got pregnant, came back to my grandfather, and they raised the baby girl together. My father and his siblings didn't find out until they were older. I'm not sure if my aunt knew the truth before she passed away. It's also rumored that there's another half-sibling somewhere out there, so Granddad seemed to be having an affair as well. Just affairs all around back in the day. Story 17. My grandfather unalived his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money, and all worked to support their families. If they got arrested, they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income, so they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there, they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to the war, but not so badly as to get permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say that they swerved to miss a kangaroo and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 kilometers per hour, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts. And nobody found them or their car for an hour or so, and nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a roo and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. Story 18. My grandfather, who was my mother's stepfather, felt up on my mother when she was 6, and he repeatedly assaulted her older sister. My grandmother knew about it and kicked him out only for a short while. Then she took him back in and kicked out her 14-year-old daughter, my mom's older sister, and sent her to live with her stepmother and biological father, knowing full well her stepmother beat the crap out of her on a regular basis. My mother told me when I was an adult and complaining about how my grandma was sexist because she never let me go fishing with my grandpa and always let my brother go. Turns out my grandma just knew he had a thing for little girls and at least tried-ish to make sure my sister and I were never alone with him. Thankfully, neither my sister nor I were touched by him, even though my mother tried repeatedly to get me alone with him. I also realized in my 30s, after a decade of therapy and different meds, that my mother was severely abusive towards me via emotional incest. She found out I was being abused by my older brother and made it a point to leave me alone with him as often as possible, and make me ask him and be alone with him to use family items like the computer or PlayStation. She would wait until he was done and then make me go give her a back rub while she was naked and sleep in her bed with her. She and my aunt both swear they're not messed up, and I still hang out with my grandpa and grandpedo. I don't really talk with that side of the family anymore. It is a wonder how OP grew up and is well adjusted whatsoever. This is some serious trauma roots here. That's horrible stuff. From the sounds of it, at least, it sounds like OP is definitely going to break the generational trauma, which is great, fantastic for them. But still, having to go through that? Yikes. Story 19. I have two. The first one being that one of my uncles, who I had spoken to a lot when I was younger, was arrested for having CP. His dad was in a similar spot, and needless to say, after that I lost contact with that side of the family, as they refused to tell law enforcement for far too long. The other family secret was my dad had been shot and unalived in a different state only a little bit after my birth. Miraculously enough, I never noticed any absence of a father figure in my youth, and I just learned about it out of the blue. Story 20. My father met my mother in the Philippines when he was stationed there in the Navy. He married her there and conceived me. He went away to finish his tour of duty. My mother moved to America when she was a month away from giving birth to me. She moved in with relatives in Texas. My father's tour ended while he was in Hawaii. He met a woman there and called my mom in America asking for a divorce. He wanted to take back his recent marriage to her with a kid on the way because he had a hot one-night stand. My mother was already scared being in a new country, not knowing much English. Add to this that she was pregnant, about to give birth, and her husband was dumping her. My Texan uncle got on a plane to Hawaii, prepared to kick my father's butt. He somehow talked my father into being a man and taking responsibility for his wife and child. The fact that the fling dumped his butt sure helped. He was back by the time I was born. I learned all of this when I was 11, around the time my parents got divorced. It was only the first of countless dark family secrets I would come to learn during my teenage years. Story 21. Not me, but a family friend passed away last year. We met because our daughters did karate together. I was friends with both him and his wife. Still friends with his wife. He was already in his 70s when we met. His wife is about 20 years younger than him. He had a fascinating life story, and I wanted to record it for his daughter. She was going through some difficult times as a young teen. She acted very badly towards him, and I felt, based on my own difficult teenage years and experiences with my dad, that she might one day want to know him better, especially since he was already quite old and not in great health. I felt bad that she would likely get to know her dad as an adult. So I spent several hours with him making records of his stories from his life. It was really interesting. After he passed away, I sent the recordings in USB drives to his wife. She got back to me and said they just threw them away. It came out that he had touched his daughter. I felt absolutely gut-punched and so angry at this old guy who was funny and a bit ornery.